At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Now, before I introduce my first guest, let me just give you a bit of background to this podcast to help you understand what it's all about. So I'm currently working as a Trees and Woodland Advisor for National Trust, and I'm an Ancient Tree Forum trustee, but I'm also a dad, a middle-aged white guy living in the UK, and someone on a lifelong journey to find out all I can about trees, interesting people, and the ever-changing world around us. To help you visualise what I'd like this podcast to become, I want you to imagine a young tree that's only just burst forth into the sky from its seed and in the early stages of laying down roots. Like the concentric rings of a tree trunk, each episode I share with you will give us a new layer of growth, reaching out from the heartwood to expand our horizons as we seek what trees mean to different people and their lives today. My hope is that in some small way, these conversations will help inspire people to look after and treasure trees in their lives too. And I'm guessing you must quite like them already to have arrived here listening to this. So it's time to introduce my first guest, Dr. Amy Cardinal Christianson, a forest fire researcher who lives in Alberta, Canada, and a woman with ancestral connections to the indigenous Métis people. She works for the federal government in Canada, educating people about fire practices past and present, and she co-hosts the Good Fire podcast, which reminds us that fire has long been used as a tool by ancient cultures to the benefit of both forest ecology and sustainable land stewardship. We talk about Amy's deep personal bonds with trees, how forgotten wisdom remains essential in the face of climatic change, and how knowledge is viewed differently within the scientific and indigenous communities that she supports through her work. Amy, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. It's an honour to host you as my first guest, and thanks for joining us from halfway around the world in Canada.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Nice to meet you.
I can't wait to get your take on trees, climate change, fire, and sustainable living. But first, Amy, let's explore what trees mean to you.
Yeah, so I think for me, and I think for many Indigenous people in Canada, we don't consider trees as just something inanimate, right? For us, they're a non-human relative. And I think for me, like I can't imagine a life without trees. Basically, we have it in Cree teaching, like the principle of Okotowin, which basically is the kinship, or, that everything's related, that everything depends on one another. And so when I look at like trees, like we often call many of like some of our trees like grandmother trees, and they basically hold knowledge, and we take our prayers to them and other things because we believe that, we're connected to them. They're also connected and hosts for our other non-human relatives like animals, birds, insects, other things. So yeah, for me, I live like on a small property, surrounded by trees, and I just can't imagine not being that. But I also honestly see the other side of trees when, they're unhealthy and we don't have a good relationship with trees, and the danger that can bring to people as well.
So how far back does that relationship go for you? And are there people you think of when you think about those earliest memories with trees?
Yeah, I can't remember really a memory without, because even where I grew up, we were like in the northern boreal forest surrounded by trees. My parents lived on the edge of town. And so lots of my memories too are even just about like how trees looked, like if that makes sense. Like, for example, like in the fall in the boreal forest, we have aspen and poplar trees here that just turn the most beautiful color of orange. And so I have lots of memories growing up and just the trees like set in that blazing orange against like the bright blue sky. Yeah, and I think that lots of my memories, I think like most Indigenous people are, from outside, right? Being outside, being on the land, taking place in cultural activity. And for us, many of our cultural activities are so tied to trees that it's almost impossible to separate from who we are.
Yeah, I've heard actually that I think it's an aspen that is like perhaps the largest single tree organism where it's kind of cloned thousands of times, but actually it's genetically the same tree. Have you seen anything like that where you are?
Yeah, so yeah, our aspen trees are, even though it looks like multiple trees above ground, they're all fed from a lot of the same root system underground. So, the nice thing about that is obviously that it's like a community of trees, like their own family. But then at the same time, when one's impacted, lots are. And so that's, I guess, the one sad thing about that. But yeah, aspen trees are my favorite trees, and primarily because of that, because I just love, just how extensive they are across our landscape. But for Indigenous people, one thing actually is because of the pervasiveness of aspen trees, especially in the boreal forest, is that, we use fire to kind of burn those trees away because otherwise they just come in like crazy, almost like weeds. So to try and keep meadows and other places open, yeah, we use fire to burn the small ones back.
And fire is a really key part of your life now, isn't it? Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
So I think growing up in the north and in Canada, like wildland fires like are just part of, I guess, our existence, right? Like you get used to in the summer and the hot months seeing smoke, um, communities being impacted. It's obviously a lot worse now than when I was growing up because of climate change and a variety of other reasons. But I think too, like I just never knew not being intertwined with fire and forest fires until I actually moved south to a more urban center. And then I realized there that not everyone in, lots of my extended family members and other people are involved in fire. A lot of friends are firefighters. And yeah, I just never realized that other people kind of weren't like that. But then that's what led me kind of to do my research to, look into why fire is just like so important and such a natural part of life for us, and, and what's gone wrong with fire and with the health of our forests in Canada.
Yeah, because fire is just such an elemental force, isn't it? And perhaps people don't realize that it is a natural part of a forest ecosystem, or certainly it would have been. So what's going on there now then? How do we maybe view it differently, and why has that changed?
Yeah, so I think, in Canada, what we're seeing relates back to a long history of basically colonization. So not only colonization of our people, but colonization of our forests. And so when settlers first came to Canada, and saw the wide open land, they also brought with them kind of European ideas of forest management. And those don't work in the boreal forest of Canada. And one of those things is because of fire. Like our forest here needs fire. It's fire adapted. Certain trees, they'll only seed when they're impacted by fire. Like I was saying before, like certain meadows and other places are only kept open through fire because otherwise they get choked out by trees. And so they're a really important part of biodiversity here. But like when settlers first came, so even in 1610, that was actually when the first law was enacted in Canada and Newfoundland that banned fire from the forest. So people weren't allowed to go and set fires. And I think what happened was people coming, from Europe saw that as being bad, and they wanted to protect timber, to reduce the risk. But what they didn't really realize was the interrelationship that Indigenous people had with fire and with forests in Canada. And those fire exclusion laws basically followed settlers as they moved across Canada into the West. And what's really interesting is that in the east of Canada, where it was first settled, like as I was saying, around 1610, there's a loss of knowledge there that extends, for hundreds of years. But as you get out west to where I am in Alberta or BC, like the actual fire exclusion laws have only been in place for a generation. So we really see a different landscape and a different type of knowledge and a different like forest health as well, in terms of having like a more of a natural forest. So I think, yeah, it's been, we have the impact, not only of that, but then we also have forest management in Canada, like, the creation of cut blocks. We've got a bunch of people moving into what we call in Canada the wild-down urban interface, basically where the forest intermingles with people and settlement. We have climate change, we have drought conditions, damming of rivers, all sorts of other things that have basically increased wildfire risk in Canada. And then what we're seeing from that is that we're seeing these basically large fire events that are happening at the hottest, driest times of the month, the windy, and they're really stoking these huge fire events that are impacting, thousands of people that have to evacuate, but really millions of people because of smoke that's generated from these fires.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about the name of your podcast, Good Fire, in a minute. But perhaps before we do that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about the Métis people and actually what was their way of life?
Sure. Yep. So the Métis people actually came from basically relationships between European settlers that came in and so indigenous people that were already here. So like, for example, for myself, like part of my ancestry is actually like Scottish and French, and then the other part is Cree. And so the Métis people basically set up their own nation as kind of having both those sides. So they were often excluded from like non-indigenous or European communities because they were like what we call like mixed blood or half breeds. And so they tend to follow a lot more of their indigenous traditions. And one of the biggest parts of Métis culture was the buffalo hunt. And most of our society was actually based around that. And hunting buffalo, we used all parts of the animals, not only the meat, but the hides, the bones, everything possible on them. And so also when settlers came and pretty much almost exterminated the buffalo from the prairies, that had massive impacts on our culture. And so we used to use a lot of fire and other things on the prairie. And there was also, a different type of trees there. But then as settlers came and the buffalo were exterminated, many Métis people kind of moved north up into the boreal forest. And so that also changed our relationship with the landscape and with trees and with relatives because, our society couldn't be around the wild buffalo hunt anymore.
That's so interesting. So basically, there was interaction between forests, trees, natural habitats and large grazing herbivores that were herded around. And that would have been in a certain kind of balance, I guess. And then actually with the herbivore impact removed, actually then the Métis people and others would have used fire to perhaps, keep areas more open and control the vegetation. And then that natural process also then later came under threat kind of thing. So, really interesting how in not that long a time really in sort of natural history terms, quite a big change for the landscape.
Yeah, and I mean the Métis, we as well used to use fire to open bison migration pathways, right? That would naturally become overgrown with these like kind of forests that move in. And so a lot of areas that we burned, it was to encourage buffalo to, move up more into the northern kind of more boreal forest. So easier hunting, right? So there was like basically a method to all the uses of fire on the ground that would help us sustain our culture. So after the bison were basically removed from the prairies, it impacted our nation a lot.
That's really interesting for me to consider because I live in a relatively small island. lots of small land holdings, all parceled up, mostly farmland, extremely intensive production farmland. And actually, what you're talking about is a landscape that is much more dynamic. And in places, we try to recreate that here in the UK. But yeah, it's challenging. But it's just a big reminder, that trees, although we often think of them as things that are there for a long time before us, a long time after, they're also really dynamic, aren't they, as well? And it's important that they are able to move and that new life can take hold.
Yeah, I think too, the one real difference that I see, like when I go to Europe and other places too, is like about the farming. So what we would consider what we do with trees, we would consider also farming or like a type of orchard or something like that. Right. And so it was only when like settlers from Europe came and started telling us that, that wasn't how you farmed or did other things. But for us, like in a wheat field, you might have certain things that you get from that, but we also might have that in a spruce grove, like, or an aspen stand or something like that, or, willow. Those were all things that we basically relied on to live. And so it's just, almost a different type of agriculture.
And so, moving to the name of your podcast, Good Fire, tell me more about that. Why did you call it that? And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so the idea of good fire, I think, was kind of trying to reclaim fire. So when oftentimes in Canada, now we're seeing fire as being this bad, negative force on our landscape. And it is at times, like it is bad. It impacts people horribly and impacts landscapes horribly. But there's also this idea of good fire, and that it's that, fire is a gift to us from Creator that helps us to manage and to steward our landscape, to help us with things that we need. And so by really having a good relationship and understanding of fire and of the environment around you and how it responds to fire, it is a really important relationship to have, to be able to survive in your environment, basically. So the whole idea of Good Fire was basically to increase that educational component. So in about 2017, 2018, that was when we had some of our worst fire seasons in Canada, like we thought were bad. I mean, we hadn't seen anything yet, unfortunately. But that was really where other ideas of management started to coming up. So in Canada, we've always been full fire suppression, put out fires, save the trees, tree hugging society, that type of thing. But, especially in the boreal forest, having too many of the same trees, the same age, these kind of monocultures everywhere really opens you up for disturbances like bad fires or like pests and other things that can devastate a forest. So when those fires happen, people started really reaching out about what are other things that we can do on the landscape, besides full fire suppression. Like, we don't want to be living our whole summers in smoke. And that was really where indigenous practices around land stewardship, including good fire or cultural fire, really started gaining attention. And so that was the whole reason why we launched the Good Fire podcast, was to kind of almost fill a huge information hole, because there are people working, there's people that have always been burning, but you can't find them on Google very easily. And so it was really to bring attention to this kind of whole other work that's going on in a whole different way to see fire.
One thing I'd like to do on this podcast is to kind of take our listeners into certain situations and really kind of get them to imagine what those are like. And I know that you're comfortable around good fire, and some people may find that scary, but what's that like? Maybe you can walk us through an experience. How does that look and feel to you? What's going on? And why does it leave a positive feeling for you?
Sure. So like a good fire day would be, for example, like me going out on the land and just seeing, like in Canada, it's all around the snow, right? So when the snow starts melting, that's when we start to know that it's time to burn. And so for me, it would be going out, seeing what the weather's like, going around and looking at different areas, like, is the grass overgrown here? like, is this a meadow kind of, there's too many trees moving in? Have I seen many deer in this area? Like all those kind of observations. And then just knowing that it's a safe and a good time to put fire on the ground. And that just comes through like that experience of knowing the land, of knowing where you are, of knowing the trees. Like I have one elder who's taught me about like how he knows when it's time to burn is just by like how plump a spruce needle is. And like scientists now have like a real fancy term for that called foliar moisture content. But I mean, for indigenous people, it's just an observational science, right? Like, okay, the needles are plumper, that tree has a lot of water in it, so it's less likely to burn. So yeah, so for us too, it's like it's not a big production. And I think that's the other difference between what people are used to seeing with prescribed fire and so like fire suppression or, firefighting activities is it's just like we go out. And so I would look at the land and see like, where are natural fire breaks? Like if we were to put fire here, where is a natural place that it would stop? And so like snow, for example, like a fire won't burn through snow. So that's always really easy for us in Canada. And so one of the easiest or the most common ways is like when in Canada, like a meadow, the snow will all be melted off of that. But in the tree line around the meadow, there'll still be snow, right? Because of the shade. And so because of the snow, the ground there will be more wet. So, if you light the grass in the meadow on fire, as it moves across that, it's not going to burn into the trees because it's just too wet there. And so for me, like we go out, we take like our kids come, like if we have other people around, like we go out and we just like go on the land. And it's not like, I think it's just not a big deal. Like my kids play and have fun and we just slowly burn. Like another elder described it to me as like fire you can walk beside. So, it's like, yeah, I don't want to say it's safe because there's always a risk with fire, but when you have the proper knowledge about what you're doing, like it's a nice thing to do on the land and to hear it. And I find it like quite fun. My kids honestly find it boring. Like they like to light the fire, but then after that, it's like, because it's slow and sometimes it'll take us hours to burn even just like a small hectare or whatever of land. So yeah, I would say that that's kind of the thing is I find it calming and you're out there and you're able to see things. And what I really like actually is going back after you've done that because like we set up sometimes trail cams and you can see like the deer and other animals coming in almost right away because what it does is it removes that kind of layer of dead dried grass and exposes like the green shoots that are coming up that the deer and animals love. And another really positive thing for us in Canada is that we have frost in the ground, right, from the cold winters. And when you burn, it turns everything black, right? So it makes it so that then the soil can absorb the energy from the sun and it melts the frost out a lot faster. So we get extended growing seasons too, which as well the animals like because they're able to come to that area. Yeah, so I think that that's like an example kind of good fire. And it's all about, like I was saying, the time to burn, like knowing when it's safe, when it's low risk, and when you're going to see like the fire activity that you want to see.
And am I right in thinking you're married to a firefighter?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
So what's his take? Is he cool with that fire going on as well?
Yeah, we have different perspectives on it, I would say. I should say, much more, like put fire on the land, use a drip torch, those type of things. Like, we always need a water source. But I think as we're going, he's getting, more and more comfortable with the type of burning. And we're starting to do actually a lot more on our property burning, like in our woods, which is something that, as a firefighter would be like a big, oh my goodness, what are we doing? But when you're doing it at the proper time. And for me also, it's been for me building confidence in my skill set and knowledge as well. Like I didn't grow up putting cultural fire on the landscape. Lots of Indigenous people in Canada, because of residential schools and the 60s scoop and other things, have a real disconnection from our knowledge base. And so I think a lot of Indigenous people didn't, grow up with like a fire stick in hand trying to put fire on the ground. And so it's almost something that I'm also regaining and relearning from working with elders. But we definitely have kind of this generation that didn't burn. So it's kind of rebuilding our confidence there. So I think, yeah, as I'm getting more and more confident too, I'm taking a lot more leadership too on our property on burning. And we're lucky because we have 122 acres. So we kind of can go and practice with fire all the time.
Bringing things back to trees then, and I think there'll be a lot of people listening to this that have seen those black and white photos of settlers, standing proudly beside gargantuan tree stumps in old growth forests, and difficult to see those sometimes. Just wondered, by you, what's the kind of oldest trees around? And have you visited many old trees in your work or your experiences?
Yeah, it's interesting in the boreal forest too, because we have such a short growing season that you wouldn't imagine that some of our trees are old because of their size, but they can be hundreds and hundreds of years old. Like we have the white pines in the mountains that are, I think some of them are like, more than hundreds of years old, but they're very small, like because they're basically don't grow very much each year. And so I think like on my property, we probably have trees that are around 100 to 200 years old. And so I always think like, what they've seen. And we have like, I remember too, a study came out about like, trees breathing and like through the canopies and other things. And there was like a time lapse video that kind of showed the trees and it almost looked like they were breathing. But I think for Indigenous people, like that was never a thing. Like we just kind of always knew that the trees, like they operate in a different time than us in stuff that they, how they take in oxygen and other things, but that they're alive and that they also have memory and I mean, and the memories are often captured in tree rings and other things, right? That we can look at and investigate. So I think those are kind of some of the older trees around me. I'm like not on the West Coast where we get those like massive trees. And unfortunately, we also have like a huge history, as I said, of logging here. So many of our biggest trees are long gone, unfortunately.
I'm curious to know, who are the elders that you might have met in your life that have perhaps passed on some of this ancient wisdom or that different way of looking at landscapes and the natural world?
Yeah, so I think that's one thing that I'm really privileged about in just where I'm from and my job is that I've probably learned from hundreds of people, Indigenous elders, because with my job, I basically go to communities and sit and talk to people. And I'm always cognizant, not to take knowledge that we're there working to support communities in what they want to do on their own territories. But I mean, even just sitting and learning from the elders, you hear all sorts of stories that then you can take learnings and lessons from and apply it to your own territories. I think that for me, it's just been all sorts. And also like, even I'm Métis and I have Métis elders, but I've also learned from multiple First Nation elders, fire keepers, other people who've, really kind of have taught me a lot. And I think that's that important thing about relationship. Like, so for me, when I go and I work in a community or I do this type of thing, like it doesn't end like when the project's done. Like even my PhD, like that was 15 years ago. I spent time in a community and people from there still call me all the time, asking for things, asking for help. I call them like, funerals, wakes, births, like everything. You just kind of become part of it. And I think by building those relationships, that too is where people start trusting you, with knowledge. But that's one of my perks with my job is that I'm really able to bring those people forward so that they're able to kind of speak out more and have kind of more of a platform for their knowledge and pushing, changes that they basically want to see in forest management in Canada.
Yeah, so important that. And, we're looking at what we can do to mitigate net biodiversity loss, the loss of ancient cultures and traditions, but also what we can do about climate change and the impacts that can bring. And it's all kind of like melded together, all of those issues. And where I'm at the moment is definitely that some of the perhaps solutions or ways to mitigate those problems are definitely rooted in the past. So it's fascinating to me that, you're kind of spanning those two worlds really in terms of the research communities, but then also definitely reaching back to learn from that ancient wisdom as well.
I would say too, like, it's kind of one of the reasons why I've stopped using the term traditional knowledge too, because I find when we use terms like that around indigenous knowledge, that people then tend to think like this is in the past, or, this is, and that it's not applicable to today because of climate change and other things. But for me, like, indigenous knowledge has always been, is always alive. It's always learning, always adapting. And that's because it's observational. And so I think like lots of times I hear from people saying like, oh, well, indigenous ways of forest management can apply to today because of how much the forest has changed, because of climate change, other things. And I just always think like, we survived colonization and an attempted genocide, to be honest. Like we can do climate change too, and we can adapt. And so that is, I think that the biggest strength of indigenous knowledge is, for me, it's a science that's grounded in really longitudinal. So like, a long time of observation and of being on the land. And I mean, lots of our knowledge around fire was like, from practice, like putting fire on the land. What happened, like watching lightning cause fires and seeing what lightning caused fires would do. And then saying like, can we replicate that? So for me, it's not like a huge difference, I guess, of what we're doing. I mean, my frustration always lies in like the discoveries, like, when we're funding massive research projects that are basically confirming what indigenous people have been trying to say for years. And so I think that in terms of my job, that's really where I'm like, oh, if we just would have like listened to what elders were telling us already, and we didn't always need numbers to back these things up, like we'd be so much further along in terms of fire management, especially in places like Canada, like especially northern Canada, where indigenous people have never stopped being, intricately in the land.
Yeah, we're kind of obsessed with an evidence-based approach, but by that we mean it has to be written down somewhere. But actually first-hand knowledge and experience can be hard to quantify, but that can be just as valuable, if not more.
Yeah, yep, 100%. And I think of that with like the fire thing and our forest health, right? So now there's all these different studies showing like that indigenous cultural fire practices can increase biodiversity in the forest, right? And so people have again quantified that, like, how many more of this animal are they seeing? How many more of this species? But really, when you look back, like for our cultures, we didn't have cars. We, had horses and dog sleds and other things, but we didn't have Walmarts. Like you had to basically have what you needed to survive around you in, ways that were reachable to get to. And so one of the easiest ways to do that was to increase biodiversity in the area around where you lived, right? And so fire is one of the ways that you can do that, especially in the boreal forest. So we want old trees, but we also want young trees. We also want meadows. We also want bogs and swamps. Like you want to have multiple things that you can access. And so I think even just by seeing and looking at indigenous people and how they lived and survived, like to me, that should be quantifiable enough that maybe there's some knowledge there that we should listen to.
And am I right in thinking you spent some time in New Zealand studying?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, good research. I actually worked on Mount Ruapehu with on actually it was Lahars at the time and coming into a ski field. But my interest there was I actually went over there to do like physical science work. And what I really became much more interested in was the social side. So, yes, these like volcanic eruptions happened there. They were getting like, they have a crater lake. And when the volcano erupted, it would basically create these massive mudslides that would move down, unfortunately, into ski areas where people were. And so, mapping those is important, but I was really interested at like what people are doing. Like, why are we having ski fields on, mountains, and especially a ceremonial mountain that's so important to the Maori people. And so for me, that was really kind of where I think I even got more interested in this topic. And then, of course, like I tried to not do fire and to stay away from fire, but I think it was just meant to be. So yeah, I came back to Canada and then here I am.
I'm wondering as well, as a mum, what are the kind of, values and teachings that you really want to pass on, if you can, to help with their lives, your children's lives?
Yeah, so I think for my kids, what I'm really trying is just to, that knowledge and relationship of land. And it's different or it's difficult in this society we're in where everyone just wants to watch iPads and YouTube and stuff. So I'm not going to say like it's is easy all the time. Like lots of times I want my kids to go outside and they don't want to, and that whole struggle. But I think for me, it's just that importance of understanding the land and that how important the environment is to us. And I think actually for kids, that's usually a pretty easy lesson. Like I remember when I was young and they told us like to shut off the faucet when we're brushing our teeth because, it was taking water away from the ocean in Wales. And I just, that probably wasn't the teaching, but that's what I got from it. And so for me, I just became like, that was like the rule at our house that nobody could run extra water. So I do find with my kids, like there's something in kids that just, they seem to know that already and know the importance of that relationship. And like a Cree teaching kind of too that we have is that, that elders and children are closest to the spirit world, right? To creator, to our ancestors. And so I think, because, they've either just came from there or they're going there. And so that's what I see lots of times with my kids. It's like some things I'm trying to teach them. It's like they already know in a way. And so, yeah, for me, it's just getting out on the land. What I really love is having my kids around elders. And lots of times now in Canada, there's this new resurgence in land-based learning where, instead of getting kids in the classroom, you're getting kids out on the land, learning from elders. We've put fire on the land, doing plant walks, all those things. And so, yeah, that's always been really important to me as well. But yeah, if you ask my kids, like, you'll say like, why do we burn? Or like, what does mommy do in the spring? They'll say burn, like she burns stuff. Well, why do you burn things? Well, because it's good. It makes the land healthy and like the grass. So yeah, I think they know. But like I said before, that I also don't think that they think it's too exciting at the moment.
Can you take us on a short walk from your place to maybe go and visit a tree that you really like out there or that we might find really interesting? Can you think of one?
Yeah, sure. So we've got quite a few. I have quite a few trees on my property that I go and visit quite a bit. The one that I first thought of when you brought up that question was what I call like our grandmother trees. So we have a stand of aspen trees that's in the back corner of our property that are huge old aspen, and they're like, they're big, hard to reach your arms around. And so they actually like go up through our canopy. So they're in kind of a spruce stand, but they go up and punch through that. And so you can't actually really see the leaves, but like if you went up top or flew a drone, you'd see like the tops of them. But yeah, we often go and visit them. And so like I'll go and we take some, offerings or things like that out there. Like one thing is like spirit meals or other things or tobacco offerings, to those trees. And so for me too, like I'm pretty lucky where I live. Like I just walk outside and I'm in the bush. And so we have trails kind of that wind through to get there. And so I think, yeah, that's kind of one of my favorite spots on my property where we go often.
Oh, thanks so much for sharing that. I'd love to go and have a look at those trees sometime.
Yeah, come to Canada anytime. We'll take you on a fire. A good fire, not a bad one.
Of course. So, rounding up our interview then, I'm wondering if you might tell me what would be your ideal vision for the future when it comes to trees, forests, and the people who live alongside them. What do you think of in an ideal world?
Yeah, so for me, honestly, it's easy. It's an indigenous leadership. in these areas. And so one thing that I'm super passionate about is a movement that we have in Canada around indigenous protected and conserved areas, and also guardian programs. So that's where people from indigenous communities are employed full time to be basically guardians of their land. So to go out, do environmental monitoring, we're hoping to get fire involved in that, where they could go out and do cultural fires as well, do fire response when bad fires happen. And so for me, that's really my, where I see hope and what inspires me to really kind of keep pushing. Cause sometimes I think, especially with the fire seasons we've had, you can get really down. And I've had like a lot of ecological grief, or like, I think they call it solastalgia or something, about the forest and the state of the forest and climate change and like what we're doing in our world with like pollution. Like my family, one of our traditional territories is actually where the oil sands is now, or the tar sands in Canada, where it's like, a multi-billion-dollar oil extraction facility that's actually been, downstream polluting hundreds of indigenous nations and increasing cancer rates, all those different things. So when you start thinking that way, it's easy just to, get down. But when I start thinking of like the success already we've seen in guardian programs and IPCAs in Canada, and just really turning around that relationship. And it's not only, to me, like the land is important, the trees, the forest, but it's also the people. Like I just see that as so intricately linked, and having people that are able to like go out on their territory, feel proud of their culture, feel valued, feel like they're making a difference. That's so important. And I really see that happening through guardians.
Yeah. What do you think are the keys to sort of making those bridges and helping with that education piece to really make a difference and help, I guess, re-embed that appreciation for natural processes and our place within those?
Yeah, so I think for me, like the one big thing is education. Like I think a lot of people in Canada are, not particularly tied to like the types of laws and regulations that we have about forest management in Canada, and I think are very open to new ways and different ways of doing things. Like one thing for Indigenous nations we really struggle with in Canada is like the access to funding. And lots of times they'll fund projects, but not programs, if that makes sense. So they'll, fund something for a year or two, but not long term. And it really makes it hard to build up any sort of capacity, when you're only offering someone a 1-year job as opposed to like a career job. And I often think like in government, we would never do that, right? Like we offer people permanent positions. Like I'm a permanent employee with the federal government. And yeah, but we don't do that for these type of guardianship and other programs. So I really hope that we see a mind shift around that in Canada. I think, and a really important thing is that we are like, they've done surveys of the Canadian public, and there's like huge support for guardians. And I think too, with like, not that I want people's hands to be forced, but what we're seeing with fires is unsustainable in Canada. Like not only the impacts on people, but we're just losing so much of our forests to these high severity fires. And there's been areas where, fire is a natural process, but because of climate change, the fires that we're seeing right now are not natural. They're basically annihilating landscapes. So you're not getting those nice burns where, you're getting grass and other things growing back there. Some of the fires we're seeing up north are literally scorching the soil. So they're taking it all the way down to like mineral soil, or like the rock. And so nothing's going to regrow on that for generations of time. And I think that because people are seeing that, that's getting publicized, that it is forcing people to really think of different ways. And so that's really the advocacy work that I and others do is, well, look at us. We'll happily kind of step in here and help to steward our traditional territories.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. It's been really inspirational, Amy. And I'll genuinely wish you the very best with the work and those things you're aiming for and leading for. And I'm just going to give you the chance here to leave our listeners with one final message.
Oh man, the always hard final soundbite message. Yeah, I think that the only thing that I would kind of say is just, I think that it's really important to understand indigenous ways of knowing and seeing the landscape around us. And for me, that's kind of just the one take home, right? Is that trees aren't just trees. They're such an important part of our lives and of our culture in Canada. And so, if we remove the trees or lose the trees, we can't have our indigenous cultures. And then we basically die as a culture and as a people. And so I think that, making sure that our forests are healthy, that they're sustainable, and that they're, have really good biodiversity is so important for us, for our culture, so that we can continue to live here.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.